This dead vine right here is my table grape, and specifically it is my flame seedless grape. Now I said table grape, and I want to quickly mention what that is. There are table grapes and wine grapes. Table grapes are the kind that you sit around at the table and eat as a snack, whereas wine grapes are usually made into juice and then wine. So it's a kind of a different system for both types of grapes, but most people at home are probably growing table grapes. So we're going to cover some kind of pruning methods about table grapes. I am no grape expert, but I have done some fair amount of research on it. And this particular vine right here is a little bit loosey-goosey. It hasn't been trained in the most technically correct way. So we're gonna go over how to prune it if you have a grape like this that hasn't been properly trained, which is probably true for most of you at home. So let's get into the garden on the other side, and I'll explain to you what's going on with the structure, where we're going to start, and what sort of tools we need. Here we are right next to the flame seedless grape itself. Now, a quick little backstory on this grape. It was in a pot for a while. We tried planting it out into the yard, outside of the protected garden fence, and turns out it got dug out by the dogs 3 times. I kept putting it back in the ground, kept getting dug out. So eventually I was like, you know what, I'm gonna just take this thing, plop it in the garden, and see if it actually grows. And that's kind of how it ended up here. It's not a terrible place because it is on the most sort of eastern section of my garden. So as the sun rises, it might catch a little bit of that morning sun, but it's not going to severely block out any of the light for the rest of my garden. Most of its shadow is going to be cast that way, so that shouldn't impede any growth in here, but it does make use of all this wonderful light that I am getting. So that's actually not a bad location, but the thing that's unfortunate is that I didn't actually properly train it. So when you come down here at the base of the plant and you look at the trunk itself, what most people like to do is actually train this single trunk to grow nice and thick and tall up to here, and then from there they'll split it off into multiple branches. Now, since this was kind of an afterthought, to be honest, I didn't really pay that much attention to training it. So what we ended up with instead are 3 main sort of leaders. Now we are going to probably take off one of these leaders and then let the plant split off the rest of the way, but we'll get into that later. Now, first off, the tools that I'm going to be using for this job is a set of pruners. These are the Felco 8s. They're a little bit bigger, so they should be able to handle some of the thicker branches. But if they can't cut through it, I also have these Felco 211s, which are essentially like a miniature lopper. They're really quite handy to have around the garden because they aren't that big and they make cutting thicker stuff like this really quite easy. So that's kind of the backstory of this. Now let's kind of zoom out, take a look at the plant itself, and talk about actually cutting it back. When you cut back your grape, you might be surprised to find that you really want to cut back something like 80 to 90% of the entire leftover branches. So let's get into when to prune and how to prune. The best time for grape pruning is when it's nice and dormant and the buds haven't started to break or grow. So in this case in San Diego, that tends to be around sort of February and maybe into March. Right now we are in the first week of March, and it's probably getting really close to the end of the time where it's ideal to prune it back. Now there are some things you could do to check, like for example, you can come in and sort of take a knife or a pruner, cut into one of the branches. If you see any liquid come out, there's a good chance that it's still active. But if you don't see anything come out, then you should be good to go. So what we're going to do is, like I said, reduce 80 to 90% of this. You can't see the full view, but from here, it wraps all the way down this fence, all the way to the beginning of my garden. And on this side, it wraps all the way to the end of the fence, all the way over to my asparagus patch. So it has quite a lot of mass, and we're going to take it down quite a bit. Now, there are 2 primary methods when it comes to pruning in a more professional sense. That is the cane method or the spur method. Now, the cane method is where you would actually grow up to have something like 2 branches, you can't have more, and you would trim them all back until they're only about 2 feet sticking out either direction. Now that's going to work for some grapes, and what's going to happen is all the grape production that you get is actually off of the 1-year-old canes. So when you're pruning back in a cane method, you're pruning your grape back down to have only 2 vines left that are 1 year old. Now you can generally tell when something's younger versus older by looking at the bark itself. Like for example, this has a really shaggy bark. That's an old growth, it's not from last year. Whereas all these canes that have sort of the smooth exterior without any of that bark really developing, those are going to be your 1-year-old canes, and that is where the grapes are going to be growing. So we are going to have to trim back a lot of this, and to begin with, I'm going to kind of take an assessment of it. I have 3 main leaders coming up that are quite old, they have the shaggy bark, and I want to cut it down to 2. So I like this one here because it's nice and low, it's very thick, and it has a nice structure up here where I could branch off of. Now between these 2 over here, I'm a little bit unsure about which one I want to keep. I have this one that's kind of crossing back over, and then when it gets to this point, it's actually splitting off into two separate other branches, and I think that's going to be too messy to actually deal with. So I'm going to opt to remove this entire branch fully, and I'm going to leave this one and this one here, because this one goes up to here before it splits off, and that's much more manageable to control. I like the fact that it only has two junctions here. It's going to make it very easy to maintain and continue to grow off of. So I'm going to start by going on the outside, pruning off anything that's pretty much sticking over past this pole and past this pole, which is my trellis support structure. That way I have a simpler kind of overview to look at, and then I can come back through and then clean off this interior section. That's this side of the pole cleaned off. Now I need to go on that side and clean off that pole. All right, now to clean out this. Oops, something back here. Ooh, it's really gripped on there. So now we have everything separated between these poles. Now we could come in and clean up the center. Before you prune a grape in particular, you really want to sanitize your equipment. I've already done that by actually rubbing some of the 70% isopropyl alcohol onto the cutting surface of both of my blades. This should reduce any chance of spreading disease from other plants onto your grapes, because grapes can be quite susceptible to some particular fungal diseases. So we want to try to keep it as clean as possible. Now, I'm going to go in and go for this really painful cut that I mentioned, which is taking off this big branch down here. I'm going to get my 211s, and what I want to do is I'm going to cut off, there's a little dead stick right there, but I want to get as close as I can to the trunk to give it a nice chance of healing well. So right about there, I'm going to just lop it. Oh. So it is painful because that is a big branch to cut, but the hope is that by doing this, we will concentrate all of its growth into these two main vines. And if you have too many vines and the plant can't actually support them, what you'll end up with is a bunch of grapes that end up really small and actually not that sweet. So you might think, oh wow, I'm getting so many grapes by leaving everything on there, but the flavor of them is going to be diminished. So we want to concentrate that flavor into fewer clusters to get a better harvest. Now that I cut this free branch, I'm going to chop it up so I could try to remove it so it doesn't get in my way visually while I clean up the rest. Now that we've selected our two primary actual canes to prune off of, we are going to start shaping these up. Now, generally with a table grape, you want to have something like 10 to 15 nodes per cane. So in this case, a node is every one of these little bumps that you see, and that's where the new growth comes out of. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But since this one's up here, 11, 12, I'm actually going to stop it there at 12 because I want to be close to the wire to make it easy to support later. So we're going to go ahead and remove this. Now we have one branch, so this one's going to grow this way, and then we'll deal with this guy later. So I'm going to prune off any of these extra little dead branches as well, just to give it a little bit of a cleanup. Now as we get over to this side, I have to make my choice as to whether I want to leave 1, 2, or 3 leaders. I'm going to opt to leave 2. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to leave this one here for lower growth along the fence line, and I'm going to remove this one in order to save this guy up here, which is coming off the other cane. So what I'm going to do is get close to the main branch, snip that off, and remove it. So now I have one leader there that has about 10 nodes. So now I need to clean up this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's right before it branches again, which is perfect. So we'll remove that. And now we have this leader here and this leader here. Now let's tackle this crazy one over here. Again, we have to make a decision on how many of these branches or canes we want to actually leave behind. So I'm looking at this one here, which grows up and crosses back over to this one. Now, since this cane is thicker, I'd rather save that one because it's going to have better potential to produce more fruit. So I'm going to go in here and remove this one first. I'm also going to take the chance to cut off any little branches that I left on the other ones before I forget. All right, so now this one's gone and we are down to 1, 2, 3. This guy is just going straight up and it's not really looking very good to me. I don't like that it crosses all through the fence like that. I think it's going to lead to issues long term. So I'm gonna go ahead and make the decision to get rid of that one first. Okay, now we are down to 2, so we need to clean it up, remove any of these extra branches, and then we're also going to prune it back so that there's only 10 nodes per each one of these. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So right where I cut it is exactly 10. So now I just need to clean up any of these extra offshoots. Okay, that one's good to go. And then now we need to do this guy. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I'm gonna keep that one at 15 because I like that it's up here, and I'll explain exactly what I expect this grape to do now that the pruning is done. All right, well, we could put the pruners away because we've done the painful part of our job, which was removing about 80% of this plant. Remember, you need to remove a lot in order to focus all of its energy to produce tasty, juicy, big clusters, rather than a bunch of little clusters that don't have any flavor. You don't want to waste your time growing a grape. You want those delicious grapes that you can't get at the store. So let's talk about what's left here and how I expect this to grow. So I have 2 main leaders, or what's normally called a cordon. That's like the main kind of branch off point that the rest of the growth is going to come off of. So I have one going here and one going here, and they're both branching off into 2 separate leaders or canes. So this one here is going to grow this way along the fence. I hope it'll wrap all the way around and then it'll produce grapes on that side. This other one is a little bit weird. It's crossing a branch of the other cane, but it's going to go up this way, run down this wire, and across my garden to produce grapes that way. So those are those 2 leaders. They'll grow both upwards and downwards depending on how I control them. We go over to this branch here. It has, again, 2 leaders. This one's going to go up. It crosses that branch I mentioned, and it'll grow on the upper portion of this trellis. So that's where it'll set its fruit. And then this one here will run on the lower end of the fence and produce grapes there. So what I created here is a 2-level system. I have 2 leaders along the fence to produce grapes. That'll capture the sun that's lower down. I have 2 leaders up here that'll capture this more significant sun up high. But the most important thing overall is that this is a flat kind of plane in the way that the grape can grow, which means it'll have a lot of airflow, it'll have sun on both sides, and it's going to lead to a very healthy grape. So we'll follow along the journey of this grape that's been very poorly managed and pruned by myself, and we'll see if these recovery cuts that I made this season will pay off big dividends in the summer, because I'm really excited to get some delicious grapes. We got quite a few clusters off here, but I didn't do any controlling or pruning last year, so they ended up growing very small. They had decent flavor, they weren't stunning, and it was overall too crowded, and I ended up getting powdery mildew. So I'll try to do a more comprehensive grape care as I track the growth of this plant this season. But let me know if you guys want to see any other videos on grapes or grape care, and if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below.